Greetings and salutations, this is Vespasian, and today I am bringing you an update on our Chinese nationalist army for the Second World War for Bolt Action.
You missed me out.
Oh, sorry, I did. Hello, and hello from him too. The plane you see before you is a Polikarpov I-15 biplane. It was designed by the Russians. They would have had it slightly earlier, but they had the misfortune of putting their lead airplane designer in prison. Because that's what you really want to do when you've got a war coming. You put your lead aircraft designers in prison, and so they can't design planes. And then they come out of prison and design planes for you, and then they build planes, which are out of date. So here is the aircraft he came up with. It was designed at the same time as the I-16 fighter, and it was designed as a fighter plane. And by the time of the Second World War, the rumblings of the Second World War began in 1937. The biplane was already beginning to get a bit lame, and it was completely outclassed by anything the Japanese were flying. So even the Ki-27. So the Russians relegated this plane to basically ground attack rather than fighter aircraft. Although they could be used to intercept bombers, it's just that Japanese bombers tended to have a really high ceiling and they couldn't really get up there. So typically this is actually a fighter bomber than a fighter, and in the game we use it as a fighter bomber. It doesn't have wing racks for rockets, it only drops bombs, and the visibility is not the best for the crew, for the pilot. Really, if you've got a ground attack aircraft, you want to have a two-seater, because then if you've got a design where you haven't got brilliant visibility, because then one guy can worry about dropping the bombs and the other guy can worry about flying. You can also have a nice rear defensive gun, which is always very useful in combat, especially if you're a slow-moving aircraft and you expect to be intercepted. So, yeah, basically if you're flying one of these, you're pretty much not going to be... You'll be getting a medal or two possibly, but they'll be posthumous. And the chances of you making out of the war are pretty slim, unless you get your aircraft upgraded to something
or unless you crash and get
better.
Like taken to prison as a prisoner of war, and then get taken out at the very end.
Yeah. There were some pilots who were Russian that flew this plane for the Chinese. Most of the pilots were Chinese though, trained in Russia. To be pilots, and there were Russian trainers who went to China to train pilots. So generally, it wasn't exactly a workhorse of the Chinese Air Force. That really went down to the I-16. This was basically a pretty useful ground attack aircraft, which you use when you don't have enemy aircraft to really worry about too much. The Chinese also never really got up on night fighting. Well, the Japanese did. They got their older biplanes to be used in night attacks, so they would drop bombs and attack during the night. But the Chinese pilots were never really trained to do that, so they couldn't really use it for that. The Germans went in for that in a big way, and the Japanese went in for it in a big way too. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a nice little plane, and it's pretty well armed for a plane, because it was designed originally as a fighter, so it has quite a lot of armaments. It's got 4 machine guns, I think, or 2 heavy machine guns and 2 machine guns, so it's pretty heavily armed.
They've got good weapons.
Well, yeah, they are good weapons for 1933 when it was originally designed. In fact, it was a brilliant aircraft. There were another 2 machine guns attached to it by the time the Second World War broke out. But all the same, you've got a very slow-moving biplane, basically, which is a huge target, and which your enemy fighter planes are going to run rings around. So you're just in a bad position. But that's war. That's you're using old technology against armies that have thought ahead and come up with new technology. Although it was designed by the Russians, and the Russians, after all, had a completely different military ethos, that their ethos was based on attack. Right up until the Germans attacked them, and then their ethos went to defence, and then switched back to attack again later on. So the Russians were entirely geared towards having massive weights of numbers crushing over the enemy. So it didn't matter that you had a slow-moving biplane type. Biplanes weren't bad particularly, but it does matter if your enemy have fast-moving fighter aircraft. So that's what it goes down to. What were we saying the other day about the Deniwade?
Don't know. I forgot to talk about that.
Well, when it comes down to using aircraft in combat, when you design a fighter plane, the idea of the fighter plane is to intercept other fighters. That's really the job of a fighter. It's an air superiority aircraft, and it shouldn't really be tasked to attacking ground targets. Now, when this was designed, it was a fighter. It would have matched any fighter in the air at the time, and did match any fighter in the air at the time. So it's a brilliant design for the time it was designed, but unfortunately it kept being produced. It's your lack of evaluation of enemy aircraft that's the problem. The Russians made the mistake of basically selling their aircraft to anybody, and so did Britain. Both Britain and Russia embraced the free market in a sense by selling their shiny new weapons to anyone who wanted them. That meant, and the Germans, that meant that other countries could buy their planes and evaluate them before the war started. So the Japanese got hold of these aircraft, worked out how they worked, or rather the Germans did, and told the Japanese about it, so they were able to begin the war with aircraft that were designed to be better than these types of aircraft. Which is why Germany began the war with the best fighter planes, Japan began the war with the best fighter planes, and to a lesser extent the French with the Deniwade had one of the best fighter planes, and really everyone else was on the back foot. The British standard fighter was the Hurricane, which was completely outclassed. It didn't have any decent armaments. Because it was outclassed, the British didn't have a cannon that worked. They decided to just cover it in machine guns and hope that one bullet might hit something important. It's much better to have a plane that can actually fire and kill. It's far more efficient. Hence the outgunning this to have heavy machine guns on it. But none of these things are really going to help your plane if it's out of date by the time the war starts. But this is a ground attack aircraft, and in bolt action it's a ground attack aircraft, so you use it as support, and you just hope your enemy doesn't have cap. Because if your enemy has cap, you're not going to make it. Which we found, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of times.
Yeah. In fact, if your enemy's got a cap and you're Japanese, you're fine because you've got a rear gunner, so you always get that chance of shooting the enemy down as they're coming at you.
So far, I've lost every single time.
I have lost every single time, but theoretically on paper, your plane's fitted with an anti-aircraft gun, so that's useful. But there you go. That's it from me. Any questions?
Yeah. How come that fighter plane only has one wing, and this has two?
I've already said that. This was designed first. The I-15 came first, and it was basically designed as a fighter. They realised early on when they were designing it, the designer had a lot of time sat in a prison cell thinking about this sort of stuff. They decided that they were going to need something that was faster, and they were also after the Gordon Bennett Prize as well, so which is the speed prize. So they knew that a biplane couldn't a biplane is limited to the amount of speed it can get because it's got two wings, it's got too much surface, causing drag. So they designed more or less just as this one came into production. Its big sister, came into production straight after, and that was the fighter plane. That was a fighter version. They would become the fighter version of this plane. Just here, but then again, lack of ability to evaluate enemy aircraft is a problem. The Japanese didn't sell their planes to anybody. They just built their planes for themselves. So there was no way of getting hold of a plane to evaluate it to see that you need to make your planes better. Whereas the Russians knew that they were going to come up against the Italian fighters, the C-32, I think, was the main Italian fighter at the time, which was a biplane. The Germans had a biplane, my brain's melting. Arado, was it? The fighter that they were using at the time?
I think.
So, at the time, 1933, you're really looking at two of the most advanced aircraft in the world. And had the war started in 1933 for the Russians, then the Russians would probably have swept over Europe and been victorious. Unfortunately, the war didn't start for the Russians until a lot later, and by then they'd already shot most of their officers, and their aircraft were out of date. So, although Russia had more aircraft than every other army in the world added together, their aircraft were rubbish. Their aircraft were biplanes. Their aircraft were slow-moving fighters like these. This was a standard fighter. There were a few modern aircraft, but Russia was a massive industrial complex, and trying to bring out a shiny new design is not that easy. It actually took Stalin taking over the aircraft industry and ordering people who are already designing planes to make better planes, because every time someone wanted to make a better plane, they would get shot down, metaphorically speaking, by people who already had a vested interest in producing the planes that already existed. In other words, my factory's not going to make this because we'll have to retool and stuff. We're just going to carry on making what we're making, which is a biplane string bag, which will be shot down by anything else that flies. I am being critically negative here. They were actually really good planes. Not just for the era, they were pretty robust little aircraft. They could land in a field, which is what you really look for when you're operating on the Eastern Front, because your aerodromes have been overrun all the time. And there are very few aerodromes in Mongolia and in China, so yeah, it's not a bad plane, but in all military situations you have to look ahead, and the Russian government didn't really look too far ahead, although its designers may have done. Does that answer your question in any way, or did I go off the tangent?
No.
No?
That's it.
Yeah. So, next question?
That's all I have.
That's all you
Anything
got?
else was answered with.
Right, that was easy. Well, thank you very much for watching the video. Over to my sponsor.
So if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, and comment down below any other questions that you think that I should have asked, and we'll answer them in a bold action Q&A. And that's everything from me.
And that's everything from him. Thank you very much for watching, and awesomeness.